This show is sponsored by HeadNote, helping law firms get paid 70% faster with their compliant e-payments and accounts receivables automation platform. Learn how to get paid quicker and more efficiently at headnote.com.
Welcome to this episode of the Modern Law Library. I'm Brenan Sharp, Design Director of the ABA Journal, and I'll be today's host. In this episode, I speak with T. Julian Rankin, the author of Catfish Dream, Ed Scott's fight for his family farm, and racial justice in the Mississippi Delta. Over the past several years, Julian has been one of our go-to photographers for our legal coverage in the state of Mississippi. Yet, as the fairly recent ABA Journal cover feature entitled Side Hustle revealed about attorney avocations, photography isn't his only for-pay passion. In fact, he mostly deals with the art and photography of others with names you've no doubt heard before, such as Andy Warhol and Ansel Adams. Most recently, however, he can officially add author to his growing list of accomplishments with the publishing of his first book via University of Georgia Press. Julian, welcome to the show.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
You've photographed for the ABA Journal on a handful of occasions. Can you tell us what the experience has been like working with our creative team and going on assignment?
It's been fabulous, and as you said, I'm based in Mississippi, so to see the scope and reach of the ABA Journal is really cool because you do get input and collaboration with creators up here. We're in Chicago right now, and then down in the Mississippi Delta where I was doing some photography for y'all and other places. And so to be a part of that nationwide network of telling stories about the legal profession, about the people who do such important work, it's a great thing to be a part of.
Well, we're certainly glad you're a part of it. And while you've proven to be a promising and nationally published photographer, your talents extend elsewhere. Can you tell us a little bit about your primary occupation, perhaps leading with your former position and what you do now?
Sure. Well, I'm in the museum field, art museums specifically. For 8 years, I was at the Mississippi Museum of Art in Jackson, Mississippi, and did various things there, marketing and some executive positions. And then recently, almost a year ago, I went and took over the post as director of the Walter Anderson Museum of Art, which is a museum on the Mississippi Gulf Coast in Ocean Springs, Mississippi, named for a intrepid and enigmatic artist named Walter Anderson, who's now dead, but who left an amazing legacy and depicted coastal landscapes and life. And I'm down on the beach now in the Gulf, which is the American Sea, as it's been called. So it's a great place to be.
Well, it certainly sounds like it. What's it like to be surrounded by art on a daily basis?
It's interesting. I mean, for one, people, I think of art as something that's very static and that hangs on a wall or is a piece of sculpture or something behind glass. But what I found is the real promise of art museums in the 21st century is taking that art and using it as an ignition point for community engagement to go out beyond the museum walls and serve students and people of all ages and really get people talking, that dialogue and that interpretation that makes us all learn and about each other, but also about our own capacities for imagination. And so that's what we try to do is, and it's exciting every day.
I have to ask this. Do you pinch yourself when you're able to privately view multi-million dollars of work?
It's in some ways, especially if you're handling it, which I don't do as much as some of the preparatory staff who handles and hangs artwork, you sort of have to put it out of the back of your mind. I mean, if you are dealing with a Van Gogh or a Monet, and I've been around exhibitions, of traveling exhibitions with those works in them, you can't make a mistake, of course. And so there's a little bit of anxiety, I think, when you have those things coming in. But once they're on the walls, and to be able to take a break instead of 5-minute coffee break out back, you get to do a 5-minute break walking through the galleries and seeing this work, and it's a great thing to have as part of the workday. It really allows you to think a little bit about what really matters in terms of creativity and doing all you can to put out good work that matters.
Well, you actually touched on my next question, and pun intended, I was going to ask if you've touched any of these works.
Certainly with gloves on, touching, you have to touch them to handle them. That's just physics. But the most fun, I would say, is when you get to handle things like artist sketchbooks. If you've had an artist who, may be long gone and you have a cache of dozens or hundreds of sketchbooks, to see that process and digitizing those. We're going through a process of doing that right now. And that kind of stuff is really enjoyable and mind-blowing because you get to see within the mind of these people who have done things that are on walls and in museums, but then the behind the scenes, I think that's where I get the most satisfaction, is seeing the untold stories and the things that people don't always see when they first walk in a museum.
Yeah, I actually can agree with that. As a design director for the Journal and also as an artist myself, for Christmas I got Jean-Michel Basquiat's sketchbook, just completely scanned in, and it was kind of neat to just see like his discoveries and realizations, and he thought textually, even though he was known for being a visual artist, and so he wrote down things he heard and that he would later use in his work, and it was kind of neat to see him just do that.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting, even with the legal field, if you think about the presentation of what is a court case in terms of movies and film and television, and in the same way, what is an art museum, there are these very flattened perceptions of, well, it's the grandstanding, Time to Kill or To Kill a Mockingbird, is these scenes, but what happens leading up to these calls for justice and these things that matter so much to the legal life of the country have so many briefs and months and years of work behind them. And in the same way that anything creative has a lot of mistakes and a lot of things that aren't in themselves exciting, but as a body of work, they're truly fascinating because it shows how people are able to accomplish this kind of stuff.
You're absolutely right. And I want to come back to that because I appreciate you bringing in the legal aspect. I'm sure a lot of normal listeners are wondering about that, but we're going to get there. But before I do, I just wanted to ask, who are some of your favorite artists, living or dead?
Well, because I do work for a museum named for a particular artist, I have to encourage everyone who may not know who Walter Anderson is to look him up. He'd have to be my favorite artist because I get paid to say that. But, I could go down the list of amazing artists. One who sticks out not only because of her photography, but because she was also an author, is Eudora Welty, who's a great celebrated Mississippi author, the likes of Faulkner and all the other authors who are in the canon of Mississippi greats where I come from. But she was also a wonderful photographer. And so I think I enjoy seeing contemporary artists, but also artists who you don't expect to be making work, who may cross mediums. And I connect with that because I try to work in multiple mediums when I'm telling stories.
Very good. So even though art and photography are passions of yours, you're also adept in the literary arts as well. Can you tell us a little bit about your new book, Catfish Dream, and what prompted you to write it?
Absolutely. So I'm an English major. I think English majors are going to rule the world. I have to believe that. And I'm also a creative writing minor. So out of college, I always had a love for the written word. And Catfish Dream, which is the title of this book, it's a creative nonfiction tome, this epic life of a black catfish farmer in the Mississippi Delta. And he was the first minority owner-operator of a catfish processing plant, which is where Catfish Dream comes from. There was a catfish boom in the late 70s, early 80s in Mississippi. And what happened in legal terms, which is part of the arc of the case, is that he was among 20,000 and more African-American farmers who were discriminated systematically and personally by supervisors of the U.S. Department of Agriculture through their farm programs. And so when I found this story, which was in collaboration with the Scott family, Ed Scott and his daughters and all the generations of that family who were still fighting to get their land back, that's how I got into it. And it was just one of those stories that seemed to come from the Mississippi dirt in the South that I thought had national resonance because it connected to civil rights. He marched at Selma. He actually fought in World War II with General Patton. So thinking about James Baldwin and the calls for justice from the 20th century, all of that resonated in this farmer's life. And so that made it a very interesting project.
Well, it certainly is. And what may interest our listeners even further is the pivotal court case within the book, which awarded several farmers like Ed Scott Jr. compensation for losing their farms to discrimination. Without giving too much away, can you elaborate on some of the courtroom drama?
Yes, and the court case is Pigford v. Glickman, and this was in the 90s, 96, 97 is when this all happened and ended up going to court. And Judge Paul Friedman, who was presiding over that case, and this was in D.C., admitted, and the record showed that this, was in fact discrimination on a decades-long scale. The Department of Agriculture took blame for this and again has made steps to try to ameliorate those. But the real fascinating thing about the case is that, like I mentioned, 20,000 farmers, this class action suit, when the case got settled, which was not long after it began, it did not grant compensation in and of itself. It gave the farmers the chance to then plead their case individually. They had two options. They could either get a lump sum of $50,000, and that's one track, or there was another track where you could go and try your case if you were a larger farmer to get the millions of dollars that you would have lost. And so in the case of this story, again, the late 90s, this case gets settled. In 1999, the consent decree comes out, and it's not until 2011 that Ed Scott Jr. gets his case arbitrated. So it was still another 20 years until that got settled. And so that was really what was amazing about that, is the legal justice takes time and the long arc of history. But there were some, again, it wasn't Atticus Finch, but there were some very interesting pieces of courtroom drama, and that was another fascinating thing, is doing the research on this and finding all the public records, and there's a lot of them. But it was the biggest, at that time, civil rights settlement in the history of the country.
And also for our listeners, they should know that in addition to profiling Ed Scott Jr. exceptionally well within the book, he also did an excellent job recording that case history as it pertained to Ed Scott. And I think you'll find that struggle with several different legal team members fascinating. Also, I wanted to ask you that you got a fellowship to complete the book. Is that correct?
Yeah, so this book it's part of a series that is published by University of Georgia Press, but it's an imprint of the Southern Foodways Alliance. And the Southern Foodways Alliance is part of the University of Mississippi's Center for the Study of Southern Culture. And so the Southern Foodways Alliance granted me a fellowship in, I believe, 2012 to work on this book. And so I was able to go stay for 2 weeks at this writer's colony in Sewanee, Tennessee, in the mountains, and it snowed me in, and it was almost like Stephen King a little bit. I couldn't leave. I had to write. And that was a pivotal couple weeks in getting the first draft of the book finished. So that's an important part. And the Southern Foodways Alliance, who does great work, has been shepherding this story from the beginning.
You kind of alluded to this, but what was it like to have 2 weeks of absolute calm in order to get the book done?
Well, if you're not used to having 2 weeks of calm, that's the loudest silence you can have.
Yeah.
But it was really wonderful. Sewanee is a college campus, and this writer's colony was right nearby, and so to be able to walk around and be in this mountain landscape and then go back and write was really great. I tried to unplug as much as possible, and that, just to segue back to the Walter Anderson Museum of Art, which we are all about trying to shepherd and propagate this philosophy of looking a little closer at nature and our relationship with the natural world, and how we all get caught up in our day-to-day, but to be able to separate from modern life and to slow down a bit really has wonderful benefits to us, and it's a little refreshing, very refreshing thing to be able to do.
Since you mentioned Walter Anderson, I did have a question for you about it. You recently wrote for the Oxford American magazine as well about paddling to Horn Island, Mississippi. And Horn Island was also featured in the November 2012 issue of the ABA Journal as one of the last remnants of the BP oil cleanup. Can you relate to our listeners the condition of the island today?
So Horn Island is a really interesting place. It's federally designated wilderness, and this is another, legal. If you go back in time to read up on how these wilderness places got declared as such, but there was a campaign to protect Horn Island, and Horn Island's a part of these chain of barrier islands off the Mississippi coast, and it's another world. It really is. It's only about 10 miles offshore. But Walter Anderson, this artist, would row out to Horn Island and also row even further, up to 50 miles to some of these islands in a little skiff. And he would be out there living with the alligators and all the animals and plants and painting them. And that was a big part of his artistic practice. But Horn Island, and in the story I wrote about it, we paddled out in a 29-foot Voyager canoe, the same type of canoes that they used to be on the Great Lakes, the fur traders of the 17th, 18th centuries. And we camped out there. And one of the things I came back thinking about is these islands, the barrier islands specifically, protect the mainland from hurricanes, but they also experience these onslaughts of natural forces and then man-made forces like BP, the Deepwater Horizon, and all of the freshwater inundations that are happening now because of the Mississippi River flooding. Everything that happens in nature gets felt by the land before we people feel it. So being out there and seeing it was a way to connect to that. But it's It is a pristine place for the most part. I think what's fascinating about it is that you still do find all this flotsam and detritus from the modern world, whether it's oil helmets from the platforms that are sitting out in the Gulf, or just trash that washes ashore. So it's a little bit of a prism to show us what we do to the land just existing. And I don't think that there ever has been, I question if there's ever been pristine wilderness since we got here. There's always some noise pollution or some remnant of our imprint on the world. But it's a beautiful place, and it does feel like a moonscape and a different reality out there.
Well, we're glad to know that it's in better hands than it was just 6 years ago. Now we're going to take a break and hear from our sponsor.
Hey, law firms. Getting paid is fantastic, but dealing with accounts receivable is such a pain. What if there was a better way? Enter HeadNote, an industry-leading compliant e-payments and AR automation system. Their unique blend of features cuts through the noise and helps you to get paid 70% faster. Skip the paper checks, spreadsheets, and awkward calls to overdue clients. Get paid faster with less effort. Visit headnote.com for more information.
Welcome back to the show. I'm here with author T. Julian Rankin, who wrote Catfish Dream, Ed Scott's fight for his family farm and racial justice in the Mississippi Delta. We've been talking about all sorts of things, from art and photography to his book and, of course, the law and their relation thereof. And I just wanted to also ask that this was the first book you've written. Is that correct?
Correct.
And we found here at the Journal that a lot of times lawyers also fancy themselves as authors. So do you have any advice for writing your first book? I know that, for instance, there were several revisions to this book before it finally was published.
Well, in my experience, I learned to write a book by writing the book. And I say that oftentimes when I'm speaking to folks, but even specifically in the case of this book about farming, and it's about much more than farming, but through the eyes of a farmer. If you think about the plodding row after row process of going and up the turn row and back and forth, and these endless fields that seem like they'll never get done, the only way something like that happens, which is akin to writing a book, is by just doing it. And I think that's true of anything. But in terms of writing, you really can't get trained on how to write a book or how to make anything creative. You have to be willing to write something that you know you're going to get rid of later. But I think I do really associate that with the character in this book, Ed Scott Jr., who showed such resilience and determination over time. I mean, if he could do what he did and fight for his life to get justice for the wrongdoings that he experienced, well, certainly I could go through a few drafts of putting something on paper.
That's pretty noble of you. So, speaking to that a little bit, do you think, because I found equally fascinating to the eventual court case settlement, Pigford v. Glickman, also the World War II stories with Patton and marching with MLK on Selma, do you think that those particular instances prepared him for that much longer fight for his own land, or do you think that was always his character? I haven't read the book. I think it sounds like he was that way as a child, but I have to think that those really big moments in his life shaped him somewhat, but I'd like to hear from the horse's mouth. Yeah,
and World War II, of course, starting chronologically, was, I would imagine, important for anyone who went, of any race. I mean, to be part of that and the greatest generation, and to come back and having done such a service to the whole world would change anyone, I think, and to be a part of that camaraderie and the teamwork that required. But for Ed Scott, he was part of, a whole generation of African Americans who went over to fight for their country and then came back home to Jim Crow, Mississippi, and to the South. And James Baldwin, again, to reference the literary great, he talked about this idea where it was like a certain hope had died. He used those words, returning home, to risk your life for your country, and then to have your rights not held up when you returned. But Ed Scott Jr., he did not, make a big thing about that publicly. It was something he held inside of him. He said when he came back that he was proud of his uniform, but he wasn't proud of Mississippi. Even when he had his Army uniform on coming home, they still sent him to the back of the bus and let other people get on before him. And he was actually, when he was fighting overseas, he was, again, part of a group of primarily African-American soldiers. They were called quartermasters, and they took supplies out to the Western Front, gasoline and food and all the rest that you needed, and that General Patton specifically needed as he was marching further and further towards the German front. And without having these black soldiers who were braving these mountain passes and having to have their lights off to get these things to him, they couldn't have done the work they did to really beat down and squash the Germans once and for all. And there's a great passage in the book, which Ed Scott recounted to me, when he's actually on the Western Front with General Patton, having delivered some things, and Patton pulls him in to be his recon driver in a little Jeep excursion. And while they're out there, a German sniper who was holed up in a church starts shooting at him, one of these few Germans who are still scattered about, and he and General Patton have to duck into a ditch to avoid the sniper fire, and Patton calls in an airstrike and flattens the church. And so that's the kind of life Ed Scott had. I say it's a bit like Forrest Gump, in that any of these historical moments that happened seemed to reflect and echo in Ed Scott's path. And he came back home and did march at Selma and with King, and interfaced with a lot of the civil rights workers at the time. And just to say one more thing about World War II veterans in Mississippi, Medgar Evers, who was the NAACP field secretary who was murdered in 1963, he also fought in World War II. And so many of these veterans, civil rights veterans, were also veterans of foreign wars. And so I think there is a natural connection to think about, what does that mean? What does fighting really mean? Values, what do we want to put our life on the line for? I think it's hard to separate those for those generations of people.
Oh, a very good answer, and I'm glad you delved into a little bit about the book from the World War II perspective. I certainly found that riveting. But there were several examples throughout the book that were, and he really did have a Forrest Gump kind of life. It's not the life of Riley, but it's certainly fascinating. And so I guess my next question would be, where would you go from here? I know you've got some other projects in the works, but this is such a fascinating subject. It's sort of a jumping off point. Where are you going now?
I try not to think about what's next, but just be prepared for what might come. And the way this story came about was, it was presented to me and it crossed my path, or I crossed its, and just took on the role of facilitating the story. So I'm hoping and hopeful that whether it's another book or other projects, that those will happen. And in the meantime, I'll do the creative endeavors and photograph for y'all and do other things that I enjoy. I was reminded, and just to name drop, we're talking the Mississippi in the South and law. When I grew up in Oxford, Mississippi, and John Grisham, if we're talking about writing and legal works, you got to put him at the top of the list as for the success he's had. And he was living in Oxford, Mississippi at the time. And I've heard him talk about writing, and he, again, will tell any aspiring writer that you just have to think of a place that, put yourself in these characters' lives. But he is a perfect example that, if you want to be a writer and you come from the legal field, John Grisham did it. You can do it.
Yeah, I suppose you're right. And our listeners and readers are certainly very familiar with Grisham's work. He often makes our top 25 novels every time that we make such a list, and rightfully so. He's written some amazing stuff. If we were wanting to find Catfish Dream, where would you recommend listeners go to look it up?
Well, certainly, if you have an independent bookseller, I always tell folks to get them to carry it for you or order it. It's obviously available on Amazon and everywhere that books are sold. If you just Google Catfish Dream, there's not many other things, as I was telling someone, that will come up on the internet with those two words except for the book. So it's easy to find it. There's a lot of information, archival information you can find, catfishdream.com. There's a website. But yeah, I encourage people to check it out, and moreover, just to think about the stories that exist just beneath the surface wherever you live. These are family stories oftentimes, and I think it's true in this landscape of wonderful podcasts and investigative journalism, all these stories that are coming up about court cases and unsolved crimes and just fascinating stories of all kinds that are being brought back to the fore. And that's the world we live in. These tools are right in front of us, and everyone's a storyteller.
Well, that's certainly true. And Julian, we thank you for your time today, and thank you for bringing Ed Scott's story to light.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, we look forward to hopefully hearing from you soon, either visually or textually, for the ABA Journal.